Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
I'm here with Massad Ayoob, lifelong student and then teacher and then expert. Obviously in the courtroom, the authority on use of force, championship shooter at various times, author, all of the things. Thank you, sir.
You live long enough, son, you get to wear a lot of different hats.
All right, so we're kind of pressed on time. We've got a lot of questions that I want to try to get through. I was just sitting in parts of your class, and one of the things that we just kind of talked on the way up here was about understanding the effects of stress on the body and how those things affect your decision making, but also being able to explain those things after the fact. To that end, I think, especially nowadays with technology and cameras and things like that, it's really easy to be caught in a situation where your statement or your feelings are found to be inconsistent, and it gives that impression that you look like a liar. Can you talk a little bit about how that comes up in court and strategies?
Sure. When the time comes for you to make a statement, you can expect to be asked specific questions. Things like, how far away was he in feet or inches? How big was his knife? Exactly what words were said. And the problem is the physiopsychological aspects of violent encounters that trigger the sympathetic nervous system responses tend to alter our perceptions and, to some degree, memory. One of the most common elements is auditory exclusion, probably the most common. The person who knows full well how loud a gunshot sounds, particularly in an enclosed space when they're not wearing hearing protection, yet they hear the gunfire as muted pops or may not even have heard the gunfire at all. Well, a guy who's never been in a shooting interviews that person and says, well, yeah, I lost count of my shots. Were you aware your brother officer was firing? No, I didn't hear the gunshots. And then they established that the gunshot would have been 130 decibels. It would sound like a hand grenade going off. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he's lying to you about this, and if he lies about this, you can't believe anything else. And we have to explain that and its related perceptual alteration, tunnel vision, they're not happening in the ears or the eyes. It's an effect of cortical perception. In a life or death situation, the brain is programmed to focus on the threat and to screen out anything that's extraneous to immediate, short-term, right here, right now survival. The tunnel vision is somewhat similar. It's not really anything that's having to do with the eyes. It's cortical perception. It's focusing on the threat. Now, easiest way to explain it, picture an old 35mm single-lens reflex camera with a semi-wide-angle lens, like 28 or 35mm. That is probably how you see daily life if you have normal binocular vision. You're in a threat situation, the perception changes as if someone had put on a zoom lens and cranked it to about 400 millimeters. Easiest way to understand it, probably everybody listening to this has watched a baseball game on TV. And it's our so-called national pastime, so they've probably at least seen a live baseball game, and many have played live baseball. And you know how far the pitcher is from the batter and how far they all are from the catcher. But you've noticed also on TV that one of the favorite cameraman perspectives is right behind the catcher, because that allows him to get the picture, the batter, and the catcher all in the same frame. And in that moment, they look like they're practically on top of each other. That same optical illusion tends to occur in a violent encounter. The opponent appears to be closer than he is, and he appears to be larger than he is, simply because we're used to judging size and distance by how large the thing or the person we're looking at appears relative to their background. When that background seems to drop away, it creates the literal optical illusion of the man being closer than he is and being larger than he is. Now, they asked you, how big was the knife? And you say, oh, my God, it looked like a 6-inch butcher knife. And it turns out he had a 2.5-inch blade pocket knife. You sound like a liar, but someone is going to have to explain that perceptual distortion. Oh, my God, he was 3 feet away. Well, sorry, son, the dash cam shows he was 3 yards away. What else were you lying about? Someone's going to have to explain that perceptual distortion. And the lesson from that if you're the one who had to pull the trigger, never attempt to answer those impossible details. Almost every time something will be wrong. In the early 70s, when I went through firearms instructor training with Charlie Smith, the great FBI instructor who had founded Smith & Wesson Academy in Massachusetts, he talked about the syndrome he called Fire 4, Reload 8. And I've found that over the years to be absolutely true. The mind is not recording ammo inventory control, okay? It's pretty low on the mind's list of priorities when someone's trying to kill you. Interestingly, unless something goes full auto or it's a protracted gunfight, an amazing number of shooters will be able to recall exactly how many shots were fired at them, because survival priority is blam, damn it, he shot at me, blam, damn, he did it a second time, blam, damn, a third. And the mind is much more likely to record that. But when you remember, oh, I think 2 shots, maybe 3, and it turns out the magazine is almost depleted, it sounds to someone who's never been there or never studied the phenomenon like you're lying about it and trying to minimize the force you used. And anyone who has ever been on a jury, anyone who has ever been a denizen of the court knows that whoever the jury first perceives to be lying about them, they're not going to believe another word out of their mouth. On the flip side of that, the investigators need to know it's totally unfair to the shooter to be asking them exactly how many shots were fired. How far away were you in feet and inches? When you ask impossible questions, you are setting the stage for that misunderstanding. And on both sides of it, asking or answering those specific questions does not serve the truth of the investigation. So if I was the shooter and I was asked how close was he, my answer would be simply close enough to kill me. There wasn't time to pace it off. How big was his knife? Big enough to kill me. That's why I shot him, sir. How many shots were fired? Shots were fired. Now, excuse me, Captain, you said police don't move, but the dash cam records you saying don't move police. If you lie about something that trivial, how can we believe anything else you say? And the proper answer should be, sir, I recall that I identified myself as a law enforcement officer. I also recall giving a verbal command to the effect that he should not move. You are serving the truth. You're not weaseling out of anything. You are recognizing that there is tremendous potential here for altered perceptions to create misunderstandings of what actually happened.
Those are huge insights. Do you think, kind of to that end, most police officers, I think, if they're involved in a lethal encounter, they're going to have representation usually, hopefully by their agency, obviously, but also through their labor associations and stuff like that. For a civilian concealed carrier, is there something specific they should look for, questions they should ask if they are looking for representation in something like this?
Yeah, it would be a real good idea to know beforehand who in your community is the best attorney for this. And it sounds counterintuitive for the armed citizen, but I would say be looking around for whoever your local police union or fraternal organization would retain if one of their officers was criminally charged after a shooting. In essence, the only real difference is one of you was carrying on a piece of tin and the other was carrying on a piece of celluloid. Determination of a justifiable homicide and homicide reconstruction in all its elements is going to be the same no matter whether you're wearing a T-shirt or a uniform. The guy that the union gets to represent their officers is a guy who knows how to do an affirmative defense. And the mistake people make, they'll go to, okay, who is the criminal defense lawyer that the cops and the prosecutors are most scared of? If he's able to pull rabbits out of hats and get guilty men off, he's obviously going to be great for an innocent man like me. And what they don't understand is if he made his money, if he made his rep pulling those rabbits out of hats and getting guilty men off, that means he's a great guilty man's lawyer for guilty men. The strategies that he has to use to preserve their rights and create his reasonable doubt are almost 180 degrees reversed from what you'll have in a justifiable shooting. It's what we call an affirmative defense. You're not saying I didn't do it. You're saying, yeah, I shot him, but I was correct in doing so. In jury psychology, the general public tends to hear that as a confession. And now the burden of proof in real-world trial tactics shifts onto you to convince those jurors that if they were there, they would have picked up a gun and they would have shot this guy themselves. The guy who has done a number of self-defense shootings, line-of-duty shootings for a police officer, knows how to do that. And every element from the jury psychology to what he needs to establish about the course of the homicide investigation, the forensics, the questioning protocols, and all of that. And if they are comfortable speaking for a private citizen, as many of them will be, that makes them an excellent candidate for that.
I didn't even think of that strategy. That's an entirely different way of looking at it. What about some of the shortcomings that you see in terms of training? And we could kind of go two directions with this. I'm curious on your thoughts on both, but both as a police officer who is getting fed, kind of force-fed a cookie-cutter solution to training, what can they do? And then also, what are some of the shortcomings that you see in the civilian market in terms of training and preparing for self-defense?
On the police side, one thing that has driven me nuts since I first pinned on a badge in 1972 and started training cops is the mentality, if the department doesn't give it to me, that means they don't think I need it. And by God, what kind of a anti-union scab would I be if I paid out of my own pocket for training that they should be training? So I'll fool them. I'll go, without the training, ha ha, I win. We're talking about your life here. We're talking about whether you go home to your family, cop or civilian. The more training you can find the budget to get outside, the advanced cutting-edge training, if you're not getting advanced cutting-edge training in your department, the better off you're going to be. If you have some questions about the training, how about you go out and get the best damn training you can, and you aim your career path toward becoming a trainer yourself.
I love that. Personal responsibility. That's been a big theme of mine in my job is, if you think you could do better, then do it. Invest yourself, be part of the solution. And that definitely starts with personal responsibility, I think, because a lot of police officers, don't necessarily, I think, weigh as heavily their burden, their responsibility on the decisions that they're going to make. And not only for themselves and going home to their families, but also for, the responsibility that we've sworn to the public to protect them. And what about the civilian market? What are some of the shortfalls of training in the civilian market?
Well, in the civilian market, I'm seeing, you see the shortcomings on two ends. You see in the basic level CCW training, for state mandates, for instance, as here in Arizona, at one time I believe it was 16 hours mandatory training, later cut to 8. And what we've seen in various places where there's mandatory training is the guy does wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Look at my watch. Let me see if I can get you out of here 3 hours. You guys are close enough. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And that ill serves the student. I see on the other end people having open enrollment classes where, hey, we're going to start you right off with the deadly reality of force on force. Here's your goggles. Here's your airsoft. Go to it. And they've never learned the fundamentals. And it's like telling Helen Keller, go paint a picture, before Ann Sullivan has ever reached her. And you accomplish nothing except make the student feel, hell, I'll never be able to master this. And they give it up, and if the day comes when they haven't needed it, I think that's at least in part on the guy who figured, gee, I'll sell action, I'll sell sizzle instead of substance, and train people in advanced techniques before they found the basics. And of course, there's always the comment of the late Colonel Jeff Cooper, who said there are a great many people teaching things they have not yet learned.
That's probably true. I think, would you agree with the sentiment that maybe too much emphasis gets put on the equipment and the gear and tricking out your gun and finding the fanciest, latest piece of kit instead of the mindset and the actual training when it comes to decision making? Is that
absolutely. The training is always going to be with you. That particular gun may not be. Your training, your knowledge is going to allow you to, whether you are visiting grandma in New Jersey where you didn't dare bring a gun as a private citizen, and now somebody's kicking down the door, and you've got to take grandpa's old 12-gauge double barrel that's been hanging empty over the mantel, stuff a couple of shells in it, and do something with it. If you know what to do and how to do it, you're going to manage better than the guy with the tricked-out $3,000 combat shotgun who never actually fired it. But he bought it and said, okay, I have my avatar of goodness that will ward off evil. I have my talisman that will ward off evil.
Yeah.
And the gun, as we all know, doesn't do it by itself.
Yeah. Have you noticed a shift in attitudes or mindset towards defensive gun uses, both law enforcement and citizen, over your decades of doing this? Has there been a big change in attitudes that jurors and prosecutors have taken towards those incidents?
No, you can't really take that as a nationwide thing or even as a statewide thing. One of the big myths is, ooh, I'm in a gun-friendly red state, so I can get away with anything. And anybody who lives in Tucson and has seen cases like Arizona versus Larry Hickey knows that if you're in one of the blue islands in that red state, that ain't going to happen. And I see people say, oh, my God, I live in the great blue sea of California. If I defend myself, I'm doomed. And I have seen many, many California cases where the district attorney said, good for you, kid. I'm glad you're alive. Don't waste your time on a lawyer. Have a nice day. And basically it comes down to what's colloquially called the mood of the courts, which is often really the mood of the prosecuting authority. It will come down to the facts in the given case. And when you look at the jury, don't think the jury is going to represent truly a jury of your peers or the demographics of the state. During voir dire, the jury selection process, your side has it too, but the other side is going to use that process to intensively, vigorously screen out anyone they believe might be sympathetic to your side of the case. So basically it's case by case, it's issue by issue, it's prosecutor by prosecutor.
That's interesting. Have you seen defensive gun uses trend one way or the other? More so in the civilian market, but I guess in either market.
Yeah, one thing we've seen recently, Illinois being the classic example, is for so many years people in Chicago could not even own a handgun. No one in the state could get a concealed carry permit. And then a few years ago, they became the last state to absolutely open the floodgates and go from no guns for you to shall issue concealed carry. I've got to double check, but it was looking at the end of last year that it was on track that private citizens would have been involved in as many fatal self-defense shootings of criminals as the police. And that, I think, is huge. And the big difference is not, oh my God, the wave of guns has created bloodlust. The wave of guns has allowed the otherwise helpless to protect themselves. The gun owners feel like a beleaguered minority, and in many ways they are. And the same, for that matter, is true of law enforcement today. One of the things that we have to remember is that we know more about how to defend these cases today than ever in the past. The general public says, oh my God, the jackbooted thugs are killing unarmed Americans and getting away with it. They are killing people who put them in reasonable fear of their lives. And what they need to understand is that this is not a police prerogative. People, the judge who dismisses the case or finds the officer not guilty in a bench trial will almost invariably invoke Graham versus Connor, as you know, law enforcement's guiding U.S. Supreme Court standard on use of force. What would a reasonable, prudent police officer have done in the same situation, knowing what the defendant knew? A standard known as objective reasonableness. And I see gun owners in public saying, oh, wow, two-class society, why can't we have this wonderful privilege? They don't understand. They had it before the cops. In common law, before any of our grandparents were born, the law had the reasonable man doctrine. The question is not, were you right? The question is, were you reasonable? And a whole lot of attorneys get out of law school without realizing the reasonable man test is a three-pronged test. It's what would a reasonable and prudent person have done in the exact same situation, knowing what the defendant knew. Graham versus Connor is simply the police version of what the private citizens already had, the reasonable man doctrine for cops. What would a reasonable, prudent, trained, and experienced police officer have done in the same situation, knowing what this officer knew at the time? That's simple fairness. It's simple justice. And the shorthand for it is, you don't have to be right. You do have to be reasonable.
Yeah, that's huge. to that end, we talked briefly about the idea that you have a lot of experts, and you mentioned what kind of prompts this is.
We're not going to use names because neither of us need the liability suits.
That's fair. I'm good with that. But we talked about how a lot of attorneys get out of law school without understanding that reasonable thing. I think it's also fair to say that a lot of experts become so-called experts in court who aren't. What are your thoughts on dealing with that in terms of, I guess, the bigger picture?
Well, if you want to get an idea what the situation is, I think they may have changed the name of the magazine, but ATLA, A-T-L-A, American Trial Lawyers Association, is essentially plaintiff's bar. And they used to call their monthly journal Trial Magazine. I forget what it's called now. But one thing that always appalled me, you'd pick up a copy of that in a law firm waiting room, or they would have it at any legal library. And you'd see in the back in the classified ads more retired cops advertising their availability to testify against police than you would see physicians advertising their availability to testify against other doctors in medical malpractice cases. Now, if the cop has done wrong, I have no problem with that. We are self-policing, okay? Any police department, internal affairs, or professional standards unit is probably going to be a hell of a lot busier than the State Bar Ethics Committee, but I'll leave that for the lawyers to discuss. They've got to remember, every cop who was ever caught dirty was caught by a cop. That's how he got arrested and wound up being charged with it, folks. But they tend to tar others with the brush. But that has created a very significant market, particularly on the, certainly for unmeritorious criminal cases. The cop did the right thing, but it's politically correct, and we'll get reelected as district attorney if we indict him and try to send him up the river. But most particularly on the civil side and civil liability. The deep pockets of the city that you serve, the county that a deputy serves, the state that a trooper serves, are very, very attractive to greedy plaintiffs' attorneys. To fabricate their false case, they need some expert to say that the cop did the wrong thing. And I have lost count over the years of the number of, it's usually a retired medium to high-rank police officer, often a retired chief, testifying, oh no, gee, if the guy is trying to smash you in the head with the loose ends of a cuff that's on one wrist but not the other, that's not deadly force. But you punched him in the head and fractured his skull with your bare hand. Ooh, the punch to the head, that's a red zone. That was deadly force. And I'll tell you, I have literally seen that happen.
Wow. From
a high-ranking police officer retired from one of America's major police departments that I could have wept because I had known that man. And he had to know that what he was saying was not correct. But
wow.
My advice to anybody who's going to be an expert witness is don't do it full-time. Because if you do it full-time, you end up depending on that income. The system, by and large, does work, and, defending innocent. The only lawyer who ever made a living defending only innocent people was Perry Mason, and he was fictional, okay? And if you are going to make a living doing that, you're going to have to end up taking cases that you know in your heart are not right. And you got to remember, you can't take the money into the grave with you. The only thing that's going into your grave with you is going to be your reputation.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that moral courage goes a long way that you're talking about. Do you think that we talked earlier a little bit about de-escalation training, and there's a big push for that. What are your thoughts on quote-unquote de-escalation training, and what are we getting wrong?
Well, the first thing we're getting wrong is the assumption that this is something startling and new that progressive yuppies came up with, when for as long as any of us have been alive, de-escalation has been part and parcel of street work. If you think about it, it's to the cop's best interest to de-escalate because the punches go both ways and the bullets go both ways. Essentially, if you talk to any of the old head cops, they tended to be, certainly you'd be proud of winning a fight. And if some guy shot at you and you shot back at one, you'd be righteously proud of having won a battle to the death on behalf of the citizens you swore an oath to protect. But what you would be most proud of is that you'd be the one they'd call when there was a domestic disturbance, because you'd be the one who could talk the people down. And by the time you left, nobody needed to be arrested. Nobody wanted to fill out charges. They were hugging each other and saying, "I'm sorry." And that kind of got lost. And in today's de-escalation training, it's very, very variable. Now, it's like the martial art of Krav Maga, because it has not been universally institutionalized the way, say, Taekwondo or Tang Sudo might be. You have wonderful Krav Maga instructors, and you have some whose own interpretation of it looks like a clumsy bar fight behind a gin mill.
Good mental image.
By the same token here, you have people who are giving legitimate training in reading nonverbal cues, and realizing that if you raise your voice, the other man's voice will follow your voice. But if you talk down, voice follows voice. And amazingly often, if you lower your voice and slow down your speech, the other guy will reflexively do the same. And it tends to lower the blood pressure and the danger level of everything there. So if they're teaching legitimate stuff, yeah. But one litmus test is, if your de-escalation training does not only include but strongly emphasize the fact that the other guy has to want to de-escalate, you can't de-escalate it by yourself. And it's only one step in the whole up and down ladder of what used to be called, and still is called sometimes, the force continuum.
It reminds me of that saying, the enemy gets a vote.
Yep. And occasionally in our job, the enemy started the election and we got the write-in vote to go and run against him.
So I want to talk a little bit about your background and kind of evolution as a teacher. First of all, you've written 13 books or something like that?
I think it's in the low 20s now.
Low 20s books. Yeah. Do you have a favorite?
No, it depends. They were on different topics, all related in some way to use of force and self-defense. Which one would be best for the given reader would depend on their needs. So I'd say anybody interested in reading one of my books, go to Amazon, read the reviews and the synopses, and they'll give you a good idea of what you might want and what you might not need.
Okay. Yeah, there's apparently 20-something to choose from, so
yeah.
No shortage.
Well, my next book is going to be everything I know about women, but it's going to be very easy to read because it's only one page.
Good luck with that. Well, I'll try to give that a 5-star review on Amazon. Have there been any big things that you, over the years, you've been doing this for 45 or so years, something like that?
I started teaching police in 1972, civilians in 1981.
Are there any big principles that you can think about that have gone completely 180, kind of the milestone progression of maybe not tactics or equipment necessarily, but just in general, the idea of self-defense for both police and civilian use? Are there any big principles that have just completely changed along the way that you think were milestones?
They have mostly improved. Understanding the dynamics of violent encounters, I think, has been huge. And your biggest, most classic example of that was Dennis Tooler's 1983 published study on how rapidly a man 7 yards away from you could close the gap and grab your gun, stab you with a knife, etc. Until then, it had been treated as if everything was happening in freeze frame, and not until the knife was close enough to touch you could you shoot.
So real quick for the listeners, because we've talked about this before a little bit, he's talking about the famed quote-unquote 21-foot rule. And I want to point out real quick that he didn't call it that.
No, and anybody who calls it a rule is unclear on the concept. It was simply a principle that showed how fast the average person could close that gap.
And I think that's an important thing to understand about principles and rules and just in general how quickly an idea can become a fad, Yeah. But anyway, but you think that was a pretty big one?
I think that was really a milestone, and we've seen since, for example, the rise of the Force Science Institute under Bill Lewinsky has been absolutely huge. Hard, validated science showing how rapidly, for instance, the man who's hiding his hands from you can bring up the gun and shoot you. I did my first case in the mid-1980s explaining why 2 out of 3 shots hit this man in the back, and it's not murder, it's not manslaughter, it was self-defense. You have to essentially intersect the reactions of both shooter and assailant vis-a-vis the speed of fire. The defendant in that case had brought up her borrowed gun as the man came at her in the second murder attempt and pulled the trigger as fast as she could. The first shot hit him in the chest, the second just behind lateral midline, the third square in the back. At that point, she realized he was turning away from her and she didn't have to shoot anymore, and she stopped shooting. He staggered outside and died, and the fatal shot turned out to be the one in the back. I would have to go back and look. She was charged with either murder in the second degree or manslaughter. The case was Florida versus Mary Hopkin. And what I showed there, and I've showed several times since, is here's your intersection. If you're firing the gun as fast as you can to save your life, because in her case, the correct assumption, if you don't, he's going to be on you and you're going to die. He was determined to have been 8 feet away when she fired. Now, double action revolver like she had with the long trigger pull and the long reset, the key to a time and motion study is motion takes time, and longer to pull the trigger, longer to reset. On the average, it will, and it's going to be twice as fast for a national or world champion level shooter, but on the average, you can fire a gun like that at about 4 shots per second, timing from first shot to fourth. Today's self-cocking semi-automatic pistols with the shorter trigger pull and shorter reset, you're more like 5, even 6 shots per second, and we have to take that into account. Now, he is rushing toward you. He sees the gun coming up and realizes, uh-oh, I'm about to suffer a sudden and acute failure of the victim selection process, and he starts to turn away. If he's square onto you, his torso can turn. Easiest way to remember it is half a turn in half a second, a quarter turn in a quarter second. And the quarter turn is important because very often the attacker is going to be angled toward you. When Dr. Walter Cannon first defined the fight or flight in the human, in fight mode, the body quarters. It gets one hand more closer to the opponent than the other. So now, for that shot to enter behind the lateral midline, all they need is a 90-degree turn, not a 180-degree turn. And half a turn, half a second, quarter turn, quarter second. Now, the third thing we have to factor is the shooter's time to react to that. Typical, if you ask the average person what's reaction time in a human, if they've seen studies, in athletic sports and things like that, they'll tell you about a quarter second. And they are generally right for the average population, but that is reaction to anticipated stimulus. You hold the timer, I hold my hand over it, when it goes beep, I slap it. What we're dealing with here is something entirely different, reaction to unanticipated stimulus. Think about it. If you had anticipated he was going to turn and run before he reached you, you never would have started shooting at all. So the reaction to the unanticipated stimulus is a whole different animal. It's not just a reflexive turn. It's a cognitive process, the OODA loop that goes back, of course, to Colonel John Boyd of the U.S. Air Force in the mid-20th century. The OODA stands for observe, see what's happening, orient, figure out what it means, decide what the heck am I going to do now, and finally act. And the act phase is the first physical movement, which in this case is the finger stopping the trigger pull. That takes at least 3 times as long. It's going to be at least 3/4 of a second, maybe more, depending on conditions of light, how fast the shooter is processing it, et cetera, but at least 3/4 of a second. This means at least 1 shot is going to be fired after the back has been presented to the shooter. What we're judging them for is their decision and the action they took, and this is something we always have to bring the triers of the facts back to. Putting those 3 elements together, we can show it would have been physically impossible for that shooter to stop shooting. We did that in that first case with Mary Hopkin. The attorney was the brilliant Mark Seiden, then in Miami, now retired in the Jacksonville area. The jury took 2 hours, including dinner, to find her not guilty, and several of them waited outside on the courthouse steps when she left the courtroom that night to tell her they thought it was an outrage. We've
Wow.
been doing that ever since, but here's the deal, Joe. It's not known to the general public. It's counterintuitive. If that is not explained by the defense team, the jury's not going to figure it out. All they're going to see is person shot in the back. And they've seen all the gazillion fake shootings on TV and in the movies that always seem to happen in slow motion, the whole Sam Peckinpah thing and the slow dance on the killing ground thing. And you know how fast these things happen. The general public does not. And now from the first telling of it, it takes longer to explain what happened than it did for it to happen. And now we're in a trial that might last for days, might last for weeks. The George Zimmerman trial was on the order of 7 weeks, for example. And all that discussion creates the false illusion that it all happened in slow motion, and they had all kinds of time to consider other things and find escape avenues and get the attacker in touch with his inner child, or in this case, his inner juvenile delinquent, and de-escalate. And part of what we have to bring them back to is the unforgiving speed at which this happens, and that must be taken into account. And that goes back to that cornerstone of common law and that cornerstone of jurisprudence today, the reasonable man doctrine. What would the reasonable, prudent person have done in that exact same situation, knowing what that person knew? And the more they can show what they knew, the more they can document what they knew, the more defensible they're going to be.
I think the quote that you said earlier was, you don't got to be right, you got to be reasonable. So, well, I think we're out of time. One rapid fire question, and you
Sure.
can just give me a yay or nay on this. This came from one of our listeners. Pelvis shots, yay or nay?
Very controversial element. First, you've got to remember any shot to the human body can fail, even if the bullet went where you aimed it. Essentially, the three primary aiming points on a human adversary are colloquially the head, specifically deep brain, colloquially center chest, I would say heart or heart in the spine, and finally the pelvic girdle. And any of those can fail. We see shots all the time where the shot came in from the side into the face and never reached the brain, and the guy stayed up and running. The famous Jared Reston shooting in Jacksonville, the guy has shot Jared in the face at the opening of the ambush encounter with a .45. The bullet hit just below the lower lip on the chin. A wad cutter or hollow point probably would have gone straight into the central nervous system and severed the spinal cord. Round nose, full metal jacket, thank God. Convex surface meets convex surface. It skidded a bit left, took out jaw and teeth, comes out the neck. Now, as Jared's falling back, the guy keeps shooting. The body armor, Safariland, I believe, saved his life. The guy still shoots when he's on the ground. Jared shoots back. He gets 4 rounds into this guy. The guy falls on top of him, still a loaded .45 in his hand, still trying to kill him. Jared jams the gun into his face, fires, nothing. Does it again, nothing. Does it again. The final shot, which turned out to be the third headshot, 7th hit, is the one that reached the brain. Because the shots are coming in from the side, they're shattering maxillofacial structure and never got where they needed to go. If they damage the computer housing, they never get in to short circuit the computer. And that's how headshots can fail. Very often on frontal shots, a sloping forehead. If you reach up, if your listeners right now reach up and feel your face, the bone structure is V-shaped, like the front of a Russian tank to deflect incoming force. And that also can make what should have been an instant neutralization shot a failure. The heart shot, it's a terrible public myth that the heart shot's an instant kill. Medical literature is replete with people who've been shot through the heart and survived, and many who have kept shooting for several seconds after being shot. The pelvic shot became controversial because there were 2 schools of thought about it from the whole ballistics wars back that started in the 80s. What the gun magazines called the morgue monsters on one side, talking about actual shooting results, and the Jell-O junkies on the other side, the people who relied primarily at that time on ballistic gelatin testing. And, of course, each of those was a piece of the puzzle, and the truth was in the middle. Because one of the advocates for light, fast bullets had worked on a high incident felony squad unit where he and his buddies had shot multiple bad guys. He pointed out that they had been told by the medical examiner in their very large city, if you need to anchor a man, either put a bullet through the brainstem, or if you can't make that shot, you need to anchor him so you can make that shot. Break the pelvis, you put a serious fracture in the pelvis, he'll be down within a step. That man wrote a book before he died, a very famous book on gunfighting. Oh, hell, it was Jim Cirillo from the New York City Stakeout Squad. And the book is Guns, Bullets, and Gunfighting by Jim Cirillo. He said flatly in that book, everyone we shot in the pelvis fell. On the other side was a very famous doctor, and neither man is still alive to continue the debate, who had the exact opposite theory, that you wanted the heaviest bullet going at a slow velocity to do the most damage, and tended to be rather harsh with anyone who disagreed with him. And because the other guy had recommended the pelvic shot, and it was kind of not invented here, oh, that's BS, it won't work. If you look at history, the pelvic shot, certainly like the hard shot or the head shot, can fail. If you hit me, for example, in the iliac crest as I'm facing you, and take off maybe, half an inch of bone, it's going to be kind of like I was a 1959 Cadillac and you shot off my tail fin. I'll be hurt about it, but I won't be immobilized. If you put the same shot into the same location going downward, okay, as you and I are struggling belly to belly and I'm trying to stick a knife into you, I am going to be dropping because you will just have shattered the cross-section of skeletal support, and I can no longer stand unless I can hang on to you. So any shot can fail. There have been, for the pelvic shot to work, you need to hit solid bone, and you need to hit it with something powerful. A .22 is probably not going to do it. A pre-fragmented bullet is probably not going to do it. And a .25 auto is probably not going to do it. And that's why I've told people for decades, friends don't let friends carry mouse guns. But in the end, we need to be jacks of all trades. We need a working knowledge of tactical anatomy. We need skill with a gun. We need to know how and when to use it. And in the end, to bring that all together.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time. I think we're out of it. I hope someday maybe we could do a follow-up to this.
You bet. Anytime.
I had a huge list, and we got through quite a bit, so I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the good work you're doing, and I thank your listeners for listening.
All right. Thanks a lot.